Good morning and welcome to the public part of the 12th meeting of the Public Audit and Post-Legislative Scrutiny Committee in 2020. Agenda item 2 is decision on taking business in private. I'm assuming that everyone agrees unless a member indicates otherwise. So does any member object to taking item 5 in private? Only raise your hand if you object. Members have agreed to take item 5 in private. Agenda item 3 is the Section 23 report on early learning and childcare. Can I welcome Caroline Gardner, the Auditor General for Scotland, Tricia Meldrum, Senior Manager, and Rebecca Smallwood, Audit Manager, Performance Audit and Best Value from Audit Scotland. Can I invite the Auditor General to make an opening statement?
Convener, today's report is the second in our planned series on the expansion of funded early learning and childcare. It provides an update on the risks and recommendations in our initial report in February 2018. Since this report was published on the 3rd of March, plans for the expansion have changed in response to the impact of COVID-19. On the 30th of March, ministers laid an order in the Parliament to revoke the deadline for the expansion so that there is no longer an obligation on councils to deliver 1,140 hours by August. The Scottish Government has said that it remains committed to the expansion and will set a revised deadline. The report highlights steady progress in preparing for the expansion up until that point, broadly in line at a national level with plans to deliver the increase in hours by August 2020. However, those plans did require a lot to be achieved over the summer months, creating a number of significant risks around getting enough people and buildings in place to deliver the expansion. We reported that some aspects of the policy, such as delivering flexibility and choice, would not be fully implemented by August. The report recognised the scale of planning activity underway, stakeholders were working well at a national level, and there was effective national oversight of the expansion. However, even before the impact of COVID-19, important challenges remained. As at September last year, councils still needed to recruit around half of the additional staff they needed for the expansion, and private and third sector providers of early learning and childcare, including childminders, continue to report significant workforce challenges that threaten their sustainability. There were also big risks around developing the necessary infrastructure, with around half of the places being developed due to complete over this summer. The Scottish Government had made a lot of progress on evaluation since our 2018 report, but it still needed to finalise some important measures, including the longer-term economic benefits. Gaps in baseline equalities data mean it will be hard to fully assess the impact on some groups of children and families. We set out recommendations for the Scottish Government and councils as they continue to expand early learning and childcare, and we hope these will be useful when planning resumes. As always, Convener, we're happy to answer the committee's questions.
Thank you, Auditor General. I'm now going to hand to Liam Kerr to open up the questioning on behalf.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Auditor General and your team. I'm interested first in the funding to councils. Now, the funding model chosen to distribute the funds in 2020-21 has resulted in some councils receiving less funding than under a formula-based distribution. Can you tell us which local authorities were most likely to be disadvantaged by this approach, and do you anticipate this funding model being revised in the future?
To Rebecca Smallwood to give you the details. The distribution from Scottish Government to the 32 councils across Scotland was the subject of a lot of discussion and negotiation between the Scottish Government and COSLA. And the process was a discussion between whether it should be formula-based or based on the plans that individual local authorities had drawn up and the costs of those. Rebecca, I wonder if I can ask you to talk Mr. Kerr through that in a bit more detail, please.
Good morning. Yes, as we state in the report, the funding distribution model was based on the templates that councils submitted to the Scottish Government rather than a formula-based approach. As a result of that, our modelling found that on average it was rural councils were more likely to receive less under the financial template approach than they would have under the formula-based approach. We know that the approach for funding distribution is something that the Scottish Government and partners have been looking at when the multi-year settlement ends. So for a new deal in 22-23, they've been looking at how they will take forward distribution for that. That was something that was happening pre-COVID. The financial working group that had been set up was discussing the various ways in which this could be taken forward. That then has to be agreed by the settlement and distribution group, with then political leaders having the final say on distribution. That was all progressing pre-COVID. I don't have an update on what the impact of that might be on timescales going forward.
Thank you. Can you tell me, though, the impact going forward you mentioned, but can you give us an idea what's been the practical impact of the funding settlement on those councils that received less?
So what we know is that some councils have adjusted their plans in response to the funding that was available to them. As a result of what they might have changed the models of ELC that were on offer to allow them to deliver within the funding that they had available.
Right, at this point, I think my friend Colin Beattie might want to come in and press you on a particular matter. So, Convener, with your permission, I'll hand over to Colin Beattie briefly.
Yes, please, Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Convener. I was particularly interested in this one because, according to the report here, Midlothian Council, which the bulk of which obviously sits in my constituency, is down here as being the worst affected at getting 24% less revenue funding than it estimated would be necessary. Now that is one heck of a gap. When the formula for the payment of this money was put forward, has it actually been signed off by the different councils? Has it been agreed by the different councils?
Again, I'll start off and Rebecca may want to add in a moment. You're right, we say in paragraph 23 that Midlothian Council received about 24% less funding than it had estimated was necessary. That's a slightly different issue from the issue about whether the funding was distributed via a formula or according to the financial templates that councils had completed. Once the decision to use financial templates rather than a distribution formula was taken in agreement between government and COSLA, the government then took the templates that each council had submitted. It adjusted for inflation, and it then adjusted the population basis back to the 2014 figures, which were the most recent available at that point in time. Now, the impact of that was that councils like Midlothian, with rapidly growing populations, had the population base in their template reduced back down again, causing a reduction in the amount of funding which they received. Other councils obviously received more funding than they had estimated was required. So it was a rebalancing for inflation and for population basis that caused that. My understanding, and I'll ask Rebecca to give you a bit more on this in a moment, is that the agreement was made between the Scottish Government and COSLA nationally. Obviously, there will have been different views from individual councils between that. Rebecca, would you like to add anything to that?
I can just provide a bit more information. So the inflation adjustment we obviously would expect would increase the numbers that were put in the council's financial templates. Then the population adjustment, taking all councils to use a consistent measure of population across councils, had the impact of reducing the figures for some councils, and in some cases, such as Midlothian, the population adjustment more than offset the inflationary adjustment, so that they did then receive, or will receive by 21-22, 24% less revenue than it had estimated was necessary in its financial template.
Thank you, Colin.
Sorry?
On you go, Liam. On you go, Liam Kerr.
Thank you, Convener. Auditor General, if I might, I'd like to just move topic slightly. A key issue that you raised in the first Early Learning and Childcare report, and actually you referenced it again in your opening statement, related to the lack of data and plans for how to evaluate the impact of the expansion on outcomes. Now, this report indicates that the absence of some baseline data will make it difficult to fully assess the impact of the expansion for some groups of children and families. Can you give the committee more information on these points? Can you expand on this? And also, in doing so, tell me how accurately can the impact of the expansion be measured to ensure this has worked, absent that data?
I should start off by saying that we think that the government has made good progress on its evaluation strategy since our last report in 2018. The evaluation strategy is much better advanced, and much of the baseline data is either in place or is being collected. But you're right, there are some important gaps, and I'll ask Rebecca again to talk you through which we think are the most important and what we understand is happening about them. Rebecca.
So the issue that you mentioned around the baseline data around the equalities characteristics of children and families is to do with the fact that the information they have at the moment is aggregated data based on a census, which means that there isn't information on individual children. That's something that the Scottish Government have acknowledged, and they've got plans in place to capture individual child level data going forward, but that's not going to be in place in time to have the baseline information before the expansion. So to look at, for the 600 hours, what are the equality characteristics of children accessing the service? So it would be hard to look at, for example, is there a difference in profile of children accessing funded ELC in terms of equalities characteristics for 600 hours relative to the 1140 hours? So that gap in baseline information is something that we highlighted in the report, and we've recommended that the Scottish Government look at if there are alternative ways in which they could capture that information rather than the census, which doesn't currently allow them to do it.
On that exact point, Rebecca, because you have highlighted it to Scottish Government, and I do hear that progress has been made and plans are in place, but the first report was several years ago now, and the first expansion was in 2014. The question begged is, why has the Scottish Government not sorted this yet?
We know that this is something that they're looking at, and they have put plans in place to get the IT system in that will allow them to capture the individual children data that they can then use at a national level to get that information. But it's not going to be in place in time for the baseline data. It will be in place in time for the expansion.
I have no further questions, Convener. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kerr. Auditor General, I wanted to look at our today's reality in terms of the issues around COVID-19. I accept that this report was done pre the pandemic, but any reflections on what the pandemic may mean in terms of the rollout and delivery of childcare?
Yes, as I said in my opening statement, early on in the pandemic, I think on the 30th of March, the Scottish Government laid a regulation in Parliament which revoked the requirement, the legal requirement for councils to put in place 1,140 hours of funded early learning and childcare for all 3 and 4-year-olds and eligible 2-year-olds. It has said it remains committed to that rollout, but it's not yet in a position to set a date given the uncertainties around COVID-19. We haven't gone back and done the audit work to look at what's happening at a local level, but we do know there may be 2 potential impacts. First of all, simply the progress in completing the infrastructure is likely to have been delayed. A lot of it was due to be completed in the summer. We know that construction has effectively been on hold since the end of March, so that construction will have been delayed. Beyond that, though, there could well be an increase in the number of particularly eligible 2-year-olds. One of the things which governs the eligibility of 2-year-olds for funded early learning and childcare is their parents being in receipt of qualifying benefits. And the devastating economic impact of COVID-19 mean there may be more families in that position. We can't put a figure on it, but that seems like a quite possible potential impact. Secondly, there may be an impact on the providers, particularly the private and third sector providers of early learning and childcare. Most childcare settings closed at the end of March. apart from provision of essential childcare to key workers and vulnerable children. There has been a range of support provided by the UK and the Scottish governments to business in that position, but it is possible that some providers in the private and third sectors may find their financial sustainability is at risk in the period until, first of all childcare is up and running again, but secondly, given the uncertainty about when the expansion in the availability of funded early learning and childcare will be in place. So there's a group of issues that may have an impact. We can't quantify them, but we are monitoring them carefully.
Thank you, Auditor General. You've quite clearly laid out the challenges around capacity of childcare, but there also is a risk around demand for childcare too, isn't there, around the blended model of schools, for example, and what that might mean in terms of impacts, the balance of working from home or the economy opening up again in some parts, so people going back into workplaces. What considerations you made around, particularly from the government and from any communications you've had around how the capacity side of it is one part, but how the demand may increase and how Scotland will be ready to meet that demand?
You rightly say there's a huge amount of uncertainty around all of this, and none of us knows, I think, at this point in the pandemic what the impact will be. We do know that the Education Recovery Group, which is chaired by the Deputy First Minister, is focusing at the moment on trying to get schools up and running as quickly and fully as possible, and we've all seen the debate over that over the last few days. There is a subgroup of that Education Recovery Group which is focusing on early learning and childcare, but at this stage the priority, as we understand it, that the government is taking is around getting schools up and running, and we don't have any more information yet about the interaction between the two or what's likely to happen to demand, either because more 2-year-olds are eligible or potentially because more parents are not in employment themselves on a temporary basis and are therefore not looking to place their child in early learning and childcare as they otherwise might have done. Tricia, I know, can tell you something a bit more about reopening guidance, if that would be helpful.
If Tricia would like to come in, that would be good.
Okay, thank you. Good morning. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you great, Mr. Meldrum. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Just to update you that the Scottish Government did publish some guidance around early learning and childcare centres reopening, and that guidance was just published earlier this week, so just at the start of the week, that guidance makes it quite clear that there will obviously be implications for the providers in terms of capacity, with things like only looking after children in small cohorts, so cohorts of 8 children maximum is the recommendation. So that's going to have implications for capacity for these providers. And we understand that a sort of subgroup of that recovery group is working through the financial implications of those capacity issues for the partner providers and what that might mean in terms of financial sustainability going forward and how to address those issues. So there is some work in progress there.
Thank you. And is that group also considering the disproportionate impact that this will have or has the potential to have on women in particular, who are either entering the labour market or have their own struggles in the labour market, given the pandemic, the impact on the economy, the impact on schools? Is that a particular consideration that you know the group is making around the impact on women, so we can continue to have or strive towards having an equality in our labour market?
I don't have that level of detail, sorry.
No problem. Any reflections, Auditor General, on the impact on women in particular?
I'm grateful to you for raising the question. First of all, personally, convener, we know that the lockdown seems to have had a disproportionate impact on women in terms of the insecurity of their employment, the additional burden of childcare and homeschooling while children are at home, and just the greater domestic workload of everybody being at home all the time. I would expect the government to be thinking seriously about the equalities impact of their plans for reopening early learning and childcare and picking up the expansion again. Gender's a big part of that, but it's not the only part. We know there are other significant inequalities in the labour market that good, universally funded early learning and childcare should be able to make an impact on. But as Tricia said, we've really just got the first set of guidance coming out now about reopening, and I don't think the government has yet published anything that would let us see how they're taking account of those equalities impacts.
Thank you, Auditor General. Auditor, can you chat us through some of the workforce challenges? I mean, I know this is workforce is an issue that I ask you about almost every time you're in front of us, but there are some particular workforce challenges here around the capacity around childcare. I know, for example, half of the places still need to be filled in councils. I know that the private and third sector continue to raise issues around adequately finding the staff. Is that a people problem in terms of the hard numbers of people? Is it a skills issue around not adequately training people to have the skills to bring them in? Is it a combination? Is it the attractiveness of the position, of the roles? What are the key issues, and what areas should we be considering in terms of trying to build up the workforce?
It's a big and complex question, and it is one of the two significant risks we highlight around completing the expansion when it's picked up again. As you say in the question, as at last September, councils had recruited just about half of the extra staff they estimated they needed, very slightly below their target, but only very slightly below where they expected to be at that point. But they still had an additional 4,500 or so staff that they needed to recruit to have all the places available to be able to provide the commitment to early learning and childcare. The nationally available information on progress doesn't let us see by grade or by type of staff where the shortfalls might be, or indeed where across Scotland they may be. So we're talking very much at a national level. We do think it's possible that withdrawal of the UK from the European Union will make that worse. I know Mr Neil may disagree. Happy to have that conversation. But at the moment, about 7% of the daycare of children workforce comes from non-UK EU backgrounds. And it may be harder to keep or to replace those people in future. There has been a national recruitment campaign in place, which is helping to raise awareness and possibly to recruit some new people. There's a lot of training going on, as you can see from Exhibit 4 of our report, an awful lot of training in 2017-18 compared to 2014-15 through foundation apprenticeships, modern apprenticeships, college enrolments, and some university enrolments. But equally, there are some real challenges. Two that I'd highlight to start with are that we know that private and third sector providers are concerned that some of their staff are being recruited to work in councils on the basis of better terms and conditions and better training opportunities. And childminders themselves are concerned that some of the pressures around this are making their own work practices unsustainable. So there are some real shifting questions in here. A lot of work going on, but some real questions.
Do you think we're on track to meet our workforce challenge?
We say in the report that there were good reasons for some of the recruitment to be back-end loaded. Clearly, you don't want to be recruiting staff before you have got, before you're clear where they'll be working and that there's demand for them to do it. Rebecca, I think, can give you much more detail about what we know on this. Rebecca.
Yes, as the Auditor General's mentioned, the most recent information that we have on progress in terms of workforce is the information that was in the report that was based on September 2019 data. And at that point, they were broadly on track with their own plans, but obviously there was still a large number of staff to be recruited into council settings. We haven't had any further updated information to see what progress has been made. Councils were anticipating recruiting about another 1,000 full-time equivalents by April, but we haven't had any information on whether they've actually succeeded in recruiting the numbers they were hoping to. Obviously, the volume of people involved does create the large risk about getting those people in post in time. And all the numbers that we include in the report in terms of the numbers of staff needed are numbers needed in council settings, and that in turn creates a risk of displacement of the workforce, so moving from private or third sector providers into council settings. There isn't great data on that available at a national level. That's something that we've made a recommendation in the report that councils look at with the Scottish Government to see whether there's something that can be done with some of the local information available. We know that councils themselves sometimes have information on where new staff they've recruited have come from in their HR systems, and that's something that we would suggest the Scottish Government could consider looking at, whether they could collate that information nationally to get a better picture of the displacement between the sectors, understand the extent of the problem.
Thank you. I'm going to hand now to Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Convener. Auditor General, your report flags the fact that a significant number of infrastructure projects were planned to be completed very close to the August 2020 deadline. Now, the report also states that many local authorities did not have contingency plans in place should these projects be delayed. Now, obviously, one might anticipate that many of them would be delayed. What reasons have they given for not having a contingency plan, and what is the likely impact of the delays?
I'll talk you through the numbers first, Mr. Beattie, if I may. As at October 2019, which was the most recent data the government had at the point we published, there were 303 projects that were due to complete this summer 2020. Of those, 250 were critical to meeting the demand for funded early learning and childcare by the August deadline. 83 of those were confident to complete. 128 of them had contingency plans in place, and there were 39 that didn't have contingency plans. Now, we recognise that, again, there are good reasons for doing some of the work, partly just to phase the work that's required, but partly where the new childcare is being provided, for example, on a school site, it would make sense to do that work at a time when children wouldn't normally have been at school. We, I think, don't have reasons for the absence of contingency plans for those 39 developments, but clearly they're the ones where the risk is greatest, both in terms of the council itself not being able to provide what's required, but also parents not being able to access the early learning and childcare that they're expecting, with all the knock-on effects that would have in normal circumstances on their family lives and their employment.
Is the lack of this contingency planning likely to have an impact at this point in bringing back on track these delayed infrastructure projects?
Well, obviously, a lot of this is affected by the COVID-19 pandemic and the suspension of most construction work that we've seen over the last 3 months. I think as the government agrees a new deadline for its target of having 1,140 funded hours in place, then there may need to be some reprioritising of the projects that are underway and still not completed. But the government's priority for now, I think, is absolutely about getting, first of all, schools up and running, and then making sure that the existing early learning and childcare, which is in place with the 600 hours entitlement, can reopen safely in line with the guidance that Tricia was talking about a few moments ago.
But surely councils that have actually gone to the trouble of putting in place proper contingency planning will find it easier to pick up and restart these projects that have been stopped as a result of COVID-19.
They may do, but the contingency plans were generally more about having alternative childcare places available rather than about getting the construction work completed on time. So, for example, some of them were looking at using outdoor settings or using other community facilities for early learning and childcare rather than progressing the infrastructure development, which was behind schedule.
So it wouldn't help in terms of the actual physical build. It's simply about alternative accommodation, simplistically put, alternative accommodation if that new building or facility was not completed.
That's exactly right, yes.
So in fact, it would really make not a lot of difference whether a council have a contingency plan in place or not in terms of where they are now.
In the current circumstances, no. The contingency plans were absolutely about making sure that parents had access to some early learning and childcare in August to fulfil their entitlement if the planned developments weren't going to be completed in time for that.
So would the contingency plans that they do have, obviously we don't know when the Scottish Government is going to put in place a new deadline we don't know how the building projects are going to be brought back on stream. There's a lot of uncertainty. But would the councils that have got this contingency planning be able to make use of that to bridge any gap, given the uncertainties around the building projects now? Would that still be valid?
I'm going to ask Tricia to come in here. She knows much more about the contingency plans in place than I do. Tricia.
One of the things I think to add into the mix there is that councils are being advised to look at the contingency plans that they had in place around early learning and childcare to see whether some of those temporary facilities could actually be used to help with the opening up of school education, with the blended model that's been talking about, and the need to be looking at alternative facilities to support the more face-to-face contact between pupils and teachers. So that again could have an impact, actually going back and looking at as contingency plans, but with a view to using the contingency for another purpose than had been planned. But I think Rebecca has also got an update on where councils had got to in terms of their contingency plans just before lockdown came in, if that would be helpful.
Good.
Yes, just to update you, since we prepared our audit report, we have received updated information from the Scottish Futures Trust in terms of progress with contingency planning. And as at January 2020, the information collected from councils by the SFT shows that for all the critical projects that have been identified, they do now have contingency plans in place.
Okay, that's excellent. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. I now hand to Bill Bowman.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. Can I move on to the subject of governance and governance arrangements? Now, in your report at para 12, you say that effective governance arrangements are in place to oversee national progress with the expansion. But can you talk us through the governance arrangements in place to oversee this national progress in rolling out the early learning and childcare provisions? What has been working well, and are there any areas you would mark for improvement?
Mr. Bowman, Exhibit 2 of our report, which follows on from the paragraph you've referred to, aims to summarise the governance structure. And unsurprisingly, for a programme as complex as this, the governance arrangements are also quite complex. I will ask Tricia if she can talk you through how we see this working, and perhaps where the hotspots are in it. Tricia.
Thank you. Yes, we say in the report that we feel that the joint working arrangements are one of the particular strengths of the planning for the expansion, the joint working between Scottish Government, councils, partner providers, other stakeholders involved. So lots of bodies are represented on the Joint Delivery Board, which is the overseeing board, and that is chaired jointly by the Minister for Children and Young People and the COSLA Children and Young Person spokesperson. That board meets regularly and is getting updates on all the key projects, all the key risks and risk mitigation, etc., and is able to respond quite quickly. It's got representatives from all the bodies there who can take actions required to continue to mitigate those risks and to drive things forward. So we felt that there's been examples of good joint working there. One of the big changes since last time we reported has been the creation of the partnership forum. So that's involving the partner providers much more closely in these discussions with the Scottish Government, with councils, with other partners, and that involves both the representative bodies of the partner providers and childminders, and also individual providers themselves being able to take part in those meetings and those discussions. And these have been going around the country, so they've now been in, I think, 6 of the different regional improvement collaborative areas. So there's an opportunity for a variety of partner providers to be feeding in their views there. So I think overall we feel there's been good joint working, and which has been strengthened by the partnership forum and the closer involvement with the partner providers.
Well, thank you. I was going to come on then to Exhibit 2, which you have the Joint Delivery Board at the top with 2 solid lines going into it and a dotted line. What does the structure actually mean here? Is this to represent people on the board? Is this a reporting or a line of authority? How does this, if you call it a structure, work?
It's reporting, so we've tried to highlight there the Joint Delivery Board sits above, it's the overarching group sitting on top of all the other structures, and then the various different forums are feeding into that. Some are feeding in through different layers sitting before you get to the Joint Delivery Board. The ELC, the Local Authority Delivery Programmes, we've shown that for completeness, so there'll be information going between local government and the Joint Delivery Board, but they don't report into Joint Delivery Board. It's a different structure. So these are the council's own arrangements, but there's good linkages, as I said, particularly between the Delivery Support Group, which is a national group which is supporting the Joint Delivery Board, and there's contacts there who are in regular contact with each individual council to understand what's happening, what's their particular pressures, and what's their particular risks, how are they responding to those risks, and any additional support that they may be needing from these joint delivery structures and the delivery support group that's in place.
Now, I'm a great believer in audit committees and internal audit. Now, is the Joint Delivery Board meant to be an audit committee, or has it set up its own audit committee? Does it have its own internal audit looking down at all these other organisations to actually verify what they're being told and to check the risks are being identified and they're being checked?
I don't think it has its own internal audit board. It's the kind of overarching the overarching accountability is to that Joint Delivery Board itself.
If I can add to that. I can add to that very briefly, Convener. I think the overarching assurance arrangements would be coming at the Director General level within the Scottish Government. Each of the DGs has a DG assurance group which has its own programme of assurance work and of internal audit and other forms of assurance coming through. So we wouldn't necessarily expect to see it at this level, although you will see on the third line down of the exhibit that we've been talking about, the Delivery Assurance Working Group, which is focusing on the delivery of the programmes. That's not quite the same as providing that internal audit challenge and assurance on the programme as a whole, which I think will be happening at the Director General Accountable Officer level within government.
I mean, I never like to disagree with the Auditor General. I mean, it could be a career-limiting stance, but looking at this, I would have thought there might have been something about, you talk about effective governance structure. Now, I would have thought there should have been some form of audit or risk structure built into this and some form of internal audit. Now, maybe you're saying it's there, but it's not on this schedule, or is it not there really?
I think the programme has its own risk register, as all the big programmes do. That risk register, though, is being monitored in terms of external challenge at the DG Assurance meeting. Each of the various bits of work on here will be feeding in towards that assurance, but the independent challenge, which I think is what you're asking about, is happening at the DG Assurance level, where all of the various programmes come together and where there are non-exec directors asking exactly the sorts of challenge questions, taking a wider perspective that are separate from those involved in trying to deliver the work.
I think then if you're saying there's effective governance structure, I would perhaps like to have seen reference to the, audit committee, internal audit somehow being put in there. Can I just ask you one specific question? In I think para 15, the Scottish Government also established a delivery support team led by a head of delivery assurance to create the links between national and local planning. Can you tell me a little bit more about what that means?
Tricia, would you like to pick that up?
This new team was to make sure that there were those better links between local government and central government in terms of looking at where councils were at, in terms of their planning, in terms of their risks, what they needed to be working on. So there's members of the delivery support team who are link people who link in with each of the individual councils. They have regular liaison with the individual councils. They look at their plans, they discuss their plans, they talk about their particular challenges, particular risks, hotspots, etc. They can then provide some of that central support to local government to help address those risks and challenges. They can work with Scottish Futures Trust, with Improvement Service as well, who are able to provide some of that more tailored support to councils, both at a national level, but also can be very, very tailored to individuals if that is what is required. So it was really to strengthen the support that is being provided to individual councils and to make sure that there is much better intelligence flowing between central and local government.
So is that the bottom right box, the ELC delivery assurance on your exhibit?
It's, yeah, but the team feed into a number of these different groups. So the team are also reporting into the Joint Delivery Board, for example. They're giving updates at every meeting around the work that they've been doing, the issues that have been coming through from councils.
So I think I'm relying on your statement, effective governance arrangements are in place. I just didn't really pick it up from the diagram, which just left me with, as you can see, a few more questions that I've asked, and thank you for answering.
Thank you, Mr. Bowman. I now hand over to Neil Bibby.
Thank you, Convener. I should declare an interest. I have 2 nursery-age children. I'm very happy with the quality of care and education that they receive, but I do want to raise the issue of quality, which is mentioned in the report. Auditor General, you mentioned the report indicates that 10% of current providers of funded early learning and childcare need to improve quality to meet the requirements of the national standard that describes a range of actions being taken by the Scottish Government and the Care Inspectorate to improve quality. Do you think enough is being done, and why are providers who don't meet the national standards of quality being funded?
I think what we're seeing is the impact of the national standard as it comes into play. In order to be eligible for funding under the policy of funded early learning and childcare, all settings need to have care inspectorate gradings of good or better across a number of key areas. That's things like the quality of staffing, management and leadership, the key things that affect the quality of care that's going on. As we show in Exhibit 5, as at March 29, which was the latest data available when we produced the report, most providers did reach that standard. 94% of council providers, 83% of third sector providers, 88% of third sector providers, and 83% of private providers. They all need to be working up to reaching that good or better 100% in the key areas by August to be eligible to be partner providers under the programme. We understand that there is work going on to get them there, but as we were discussing earlier, some of the challenges around recruiting and retaining staff will be key to their ability to do that. Rebecca, I think, is our expert on the quality of the childcare provided and may want to add a bit of detail to that for you. Rebecca.
Yes, so the national standard will come into force, or was due to come into force from August 2020. So the figures that we have in the report are the position as it stands in March 19. Obviously, there was a lot of work then going on to try and ensure that these providers do reach the national standard. So there's specific support from the Care Inspectorate and from the Scottish Government for those providers who are at risk of not realising the national standard. The most recent information that we've got is that settings in 16 different council areas were invited to take part in the Care Inspectorate's ELC improvement programme, and those engagement sessions had been scheduled. I don't have any further update on what has happened with that, obviously given the COVID situation and whether that's continuing currently or not. But there were plans and support had started to take forward actions to improve the quality of those settings that are at risk of not meeting the national standard from August.
Thanks for that answer. I mean, I'm sure we all want to see children having been placed in quality facilities and not in facilities that don't meet those national standards. What are the implications if services fail to meet the required quality standards? For example, where would the children go? Was there enough, or is there enough capacity to deal with that particular issue about quality standards not being met?
Rebecca.
So in the first instance, if a provider doesn't meet, so if they have been contracted with and they then are inspected by the Care Inspectorate and fail to meet the national standard at a subsequent inspection, then they would enter into a period of service improvement with the council, which is typically a 12-month period in which they have the opportunity to be supported and take actions to improve their score for the future. So there's a similar arrangement in place, acknowledging that some of the existing partner providers may not be quite at the level of the national standard, but they're contracted with at the moment. The Scottish Government had agreed with COSLA and the Care Inspectorate that councils could contract with existing providers who don't yet meet the quality standard in terms of the Care Inspectorate scores that they have at the moment, as long as they were happy that they thought that they met all other aspects of the national standard. So the national standard doesn't just apply to the quality scores you get from the Care Inspectorate. There's lots of other criteria in terms of business sustainability, that type of thing, that they have to meet all of the other aspects of the national standard. And as long as the council thought that there was ample opportunity for that provider, so that the provider would be able to come up to the standards required within the 12-month service improvement period. So there's lots of support that councils will provide to providers who are not quite at that quality standard to try and bring them up to the standard necessary.
Thank you for that. I also want to touch on the living wage. The report indicates that it's unclear whether the living wage commitment will be fully implemented, both on affordability and enforceability grounds. The report refers to the living wage implementation group set up by Scottish Government, which was due to meet in early 2020. Has the group met? Can I ask who is represented on the group and what progress has been met in this area?
I'll ask Tricia to talk you through that, if I may. Tricia.
Yes, this was just about to happen, I think, just as we were reporting. So we don't know if that group has yet met. We have made recommendations about, obviously that group has some very difficult issues to work through and continuing to work through the issues. So we would be recommending that very much happens. I think some of the issues are around the legal issues around procurement rules and whether or not how that applies to councils entering into contracts with the partner providers, and whether or not they can actually be required to pay the living wage in terms of contracts, in terms of procurement rules. So there's legal issues to work through there, and obviously the affordability, the sustainability side of things as well. So quite a number of issues. We understand that because the national standard incorporates the criteria around fair work practices, and that includes the requirements to pay living wage. That's where that is set out as part of the national standard around fair work practices. And there's lots of other elements to the fair work practices that should again be encouraging providers to be paying the living wage, but there's question marks over whether or not it is actually enforceable in law. So these are the kind of issues that we were recommending that working group would progress, but we don't have an update on whether or not it has now and how that work has been impacted by COVID, and whether or not that has paused or not. We haven't seen any updates on whether or not that group has been meeting.
Thanks for that answer. Thanks, Convener.
Thank you, Mr. Bibby. I now hand over to Willie Coffey.
much, Convener. Good morning, everybody. Good morning, Auditor General. I wonder if I could just ask a couple of questions, please. One on take-up and one on data collection and evaluation that Liam Kerr introduced earlier. Firstly, how do we know that the families that should be taking this up are taking it up? I'm a wee bit concerned that at an early stage in this, we're already talking about data collection and software issues to help us manage that process. So are we reaching out to the poorer, more vulnerable children to make sure that they're taking this service up? And what's the explanation for the software delay, the contract delay with the software? I don't think it appears to be anything COVID related. So what's the issue with that, and when can we expect it to be up and running?
I'll start and then hand over to Tricia, if I may. In terms of uptake, I think most of the effort that we've seen is focused on eligible 2-year-olds. As committee members know, 2-year-olds are eligible primarily if their parents are or have since the child's second birthday been in receipt of particular benefits, social security benefits. And when we reported last, there were problems in identifying who those children were because of data sharing limitations between DWP and the Scottish Government. That's still not fully resolved, but there is improvement work underway that Tricia can talk you through. The other challenge is making sure that we have got Scotland-wide information about which children are taking up their entitlement to early learning and childcare, funded early learning and childcare, for not just those 2-year-olds, but 3- and 4-year-olds, so that councils themselves can do some targeting. And I'll ask Tricia to talk you through where we are with those two aspects of the policy. Tricia.
Okay, thank you. Yes, the new electronic system, as Rebecca referred to earlier, one of the issues is that under the current system, councils are not consistently able to record information on individual children who are receiving early learning and childcare. So children could be receiving their childcare in more than one setting. There can be double counting in there. So the data is currently based on a census snapshot, but the new system should be giving accurate information at a child level, so you can actually understand how many children are actually taking up their funded hours, and what age and different demographic characteristics, equality characteristics of these individual children. So that's one of the reasons why this new system is going to be very important. We understood that the new system was due to be rolled out in councils in November, so obviously delayed from having it in place for the August start. We don't know if, we know work is still going on. At the moment, we don't know whether or not COVID will have an impact on that November date for the new system to come into place. The Scottish Government isn't responsible for delivering this, but it does have an assurance function and it has provided funding for the new system, but it's the councils themselves who are effectively overseeing this project, which is being delivered by CMIS, so they're acting as the sponsors effectively for this project. So we do know that there was some delays before COVID, and we don't know how COVID will have impacted on when that new system will actually come online.
Okay. Until the new system appears, though, can someone give us an assurance that the data that we think we need to be collecting in the initial term and for future evaluation, surely we can start collecting it anyway? We don't need to wait till the new system appears before we start collecting important data that we need. Presumably we can collect it now and then feed it into the new system when it arrives and it begins to work for us. Is that the case? Is that your understanding?
Yes, and that's some of what's happening at the moment. So some of the things that Rebecca talked about, the census taking place and some of the evaluations that are taking place that are capturing some of that information to give a bit more of a baseline and to be able to track some of these things, but it's not going to be as comprehensive and as good quality as when the new system comes into place.
Okay, right. Thanks, Convener. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Mr. Coffey. And finally, Alec Neil.
I begin, Auditor General. I want to ask a few questions about the independent sector. because there is clearly a lot of frustration amongst many participants in the independent sector about how they're treated by some councils, and a feeling that they are starved of resources so that the council can hold on to maximising, resources for their own pre-5 provision. In your review, did you come across this kind of friction, and were you able to form any view on it?
In general terms, we found that relationships were better between councils and their private and third sector partners this time than when we reported in 2018. I'll ask Tricia to talk you through that in a moment. We show in Exhibit 3, just as an indication, that the amount of the funded early learning and childcare that councils expect their partner providers to provide has increased slightly from 22% in 2018 to 26% in 2019. Partly that's due to a general reshaping of the plans for how it will be delivered, but the movement is going in a direction that I think the private partners would be comfortable with. And as we were saying earlier, we know there are some real pinch points around things like payment of the living wage and the extent to which that living wage commitment applies only to funded hours and not the other hours which are being provided in a private setting. Tricia, I wonder if you'd like to pick up a little bit more on that.
Yes. Thank you. Yes. As the Auditor General said, we feel that relationships were better overall between the councils and government and partner providers than when we looked at this area last time around, and things like the National Partnership Forum has helped to improve that communication. But we're aware that yes, that there's a lot of variation across councils, and we didn't carry out audit work at individual councils to investigate the nature of those relationships there. The national forums and the national groups that have talked about the partnership forum and that rotating and going around the country is an opportunity to start to be exploring some of these relationships and to try to unpick some of these tensions and help to improve relationships. And there's also been things like there was a large partnership event held in September last year. I think around 200 partner providers attended that, and that was to do things like share good practice around some of the plans as they were developing and how partner providers are getting involved in those plans. Where some partner providers have been able to pay the living wage, how have they been able to do that? How have they been able to do that in a sustainable way? So yes, definitely there are still tensions, there are still pinch points, and there are still some partner providers who would say that relationships are not good with their councils. But we feel nationally there has been some moves forward, and there are more forums to have these discussions and to help to move things forward than there were previously.
And can I ask, have you been able to look at comparisons between the council provision and the independent provision in terms of really the three crucial aspects: how much money they're getting per child from the council, what their costs are in relation to the council's overheads, and what the outcomes are, and the comparison between the council provided nursery outcomes and those of the independent sector? Is it possible to get that information, or does that have to wait for the new information system as well?
I think it will have to wait partly for the new information system and for our third planned piece of work in our series of audits. Some of the bits of information are there, so we've referred already to the Care Inspectorate's reviews of nursery, early learning and childcare settings. That information is available across the board, and some comparisons can be made. We talk in paragraph 47 of the report about the guidance for councils on calculating sustainable rates for funding providers, and that's intended to make sure that all councils are funding places at a rate that is sustainable and reflects the full costs of meeting the national standard for funded childcare. The other dimension will be things like the flexibility and choice, because clearly meeting those requirements under the standard will again have some cost implications. So all of those bits of information will need to come together. We expect the government's own evaluation to be looking at some of that, and it's certainly something that will feed into the next Audit Scotland review, which will be timed to take account of when the revised target for meeting 1140 hours is set by government in due course.
Can I ask, when is the government's evaluation due, Auditor General?
Well, I suspect it will have been delayed by the delay to the target for meeting 1140 hours. Rebecca, do we have any more information to add to that at the moment?
So what the government are putting in place is, when we conducted our audit, we saw the draft evaluation strategy. That was due to be completed in spring. I'm not sure what impact COVID has had on the timescales for publishing their finalised evaluation strategy. But in terms of evaluation, a lot of the work, as we highlight in the report, has already started. They've started to collect baseline information. So one of the big sources of information for evaluation of this expansion is actually going to be the Scottish Study of Early Learning in Childcare. And the baseline data collection for that study was completed in 2019. That's scheduled to capture more information from children who've gone through the 1140 process in 22-23, and we don't have any update on whether that timing might be impacted by COVID. I know it had been considered carefully to make sure that there was time for the system to have started and the children to have gone through their full time in funded ELC, having the 1140 hours. So I'm not sure whether they will have to revise the timescales for that study. The government were planning to publish a baseline report in terms of all the evaluation measures by the end of 2020. Again, I'm not sure whether that timescale will be impacted by COVID or not.
And can I ask, during the course of your own review, did you get the impression that councils do accept the need to ensure there's a level playing field in terms of resource allocation? Because it would be very unfair if kids who happen to be in the independent sector were getting any less resource allocated to them, or any more resource allocated to them than those who attend the council-run provision. So do you think there is a general acceptance amongst councils that there needs to be a level playing field? Because they're in a bit of a contradictory position. They're both provider and regulator, as it were. And we've seen, for example, in care homes, many councils, heavily subsidise their own care homes at the expense of some in the private sector. And we don't want that to become the pattern, obviously, in pre-5 education.
Relationships between councils and the funded providers?
Sorry, you want to come back in there, Alex?
Sorry,
I didn't catch that. Sorry, Tricia.
I'm sorry. I was suggesting Tricia could provide more information about the relationship between councils and their funded partners.
Yes. Hi. Yes. One of the things that came out last year was Scotland Excel published some guidance around how councils and partner providers should be working together in order to set sustainable rates. So they gave quite a lot of guidance around the factors that should be considered there, and one of the factors there was around making sure that the quality is the same, that it's a high quality ELC experience regardless of where that ELC is being provided to the child. And that also relates to the national standards, to making sure that all the providers are able to achieve the criteria in terms of quality of provision. So the guidance says that it should be a sustainable rate that allows the provider to meet that quality provision, that also allows them to have some investment as well. So it recognises that the rate should not just be covering the day-to-day costs of providing the ELC for those children, but should be providing some element that they can invest for the setting, invest for the future as well. that allows them to pay the living wage as well. So all these factors should be taken into account. It also gives some guidance on sort of models that councils could use, and talks about the importance of councils and partner providers working closely together, and of the importance of transparency, of it being very clear how these rates are being set, what's included, what's not included, and again making sure that the partner providers are part of these discussions. So that guidance came out a bit later than had been planned on the original timescales, to allow a bit more consultation around it, but it did come out towards I think around September time last year.
And my final question, Convener, is very quickly just to ask what the take-up rate is amongst the eligible 2-year-olds in terms of enrolling in ELCs.
And I think that's one for Tricia as well.
Sorry, I think that's Rebecca actually.
Apologies.
Hi, yeah, I can give you an update on eligible 2s. So they were slightly below target. So there's different ways of measuring this, because eligible 2s were eligible for 600 hours of childcare, but obviously they're phasing in the 1140 entitlement for some children in advance of August 2020. So in terms of how it's being phased in with getting more than 600 hours, then the information that we had, which was based on September 2019, was that they were just slightly below target in terms of phasing in for eligible 2s. But eligible 2-year-olds.
What's the target?
Well, it's a target that councils have set themselves for how they want to phase it in. Do you mean the target for overall?
What's the target take up amongst 2-year-olds, please?
So for any ELC, or for access to ELC?
What's the national target for any ELC?
So I believe that's 64% uptake by 21-22. I think that's what the Minister has said.
And what's it running at?
So the most recent information that we have is for September 2019, and that's around a third. It's hard to measure at the moment because of the way that because of the data sharing issue. It's hard to identify the exact numbers of children that are eligible.
So basically, so you're saying that only half of 2-year-olds who are entitled enrolling?
Sorry?
If the target is 63% and only 33% are actually enrolling, that means with half the targets, the performance is half what the target is.
Yes, I think the targets for 21-22, but the most recent information we have, the uptake is at around a third.
Right, so a long way to go then.
Yeah, there is quite a lot of work going on, and has been going on, to try and improve the uptake. They had an improvement practically.
These are probably issues we can take up with the Scottish Government, and I'll follow up. I'm just of time. Are there any final questions, Mr. Neil?
No, thank you very much indeed, both to the Editor General and their team, and yourself, Convener.
Thank you, Mr. Neil. Can I thank you, Auditor General, and your team for your evidence session this morning. The fourth and final item today is the Section 22 report on the 2018-19 audit of the City of Glasgow College, and the report on the investigation of alleged fraud. Given the ongoing legal proceedings, the committee is invited simply to note the report at this stage. There will be an opportunity to explore the issues raised in the report once the proceedings are concluded. I now close the public part of this meeting as we move into private session. Thank you.